Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming from far and near to this conference. I'm especially excited to have you all in the year of rabbit in the Chinese tradition. In the Chinese culture, rabbits are kind, quiet, friendly, and earnest with everything they do. Their quiet personality hides confidence and strength. They can steadily move towards their goals no matter what other people say or judge of them. Their friendly personality will bring a wide social network. I hope working with you, particularly our rabbit friends here and online, will make us achieve something steadily. Will make us have a friendly discussions throughout the 3 days. And we can, the rabbits friendly, I just talked before, the friendly personality enable them to build wide social networks. And I hope we can do the same. And that the insights and the networks that you will gain from the conference will help you achieve your goals steadily. Rabbits are quiet, but I hope you are unreserved. And together we will make this conference a great thumping ground of great discussions and debates on ADM, and the Chinese societies. We thank you for making the trips to RMIT from far and near, for joining us online in different time zones and in your wee hours. I'm especially grateful for the support from the professional staff of the ADM+S Center, led by Nicholas Walsh, tasked by Matthew Warren, together with Lauren, Leah, Natalie, and others. Your contribution, participation, support, and dedication are all that matters. That your help are all that makes this conference possible and successful. Now, I'd like to introduce our chair of the plenary keynote session, Associate Professor Rogier Creemers from Leiden University. Rogier, where are you? Can you come over here? Rogier is a leading legal studies scholar with a background in sinology and international relations. His research focuses on Chinese domestic digital technology policy, as well as China's growing importance in global digital affairs. He leads a number of research projects on digital China, technology, law, and global cybersecurity. Rogier is one of my international collaborators in my future fellowship on China's social credit system and everyday life. Thank you for making the long trip to Melbourne, Rogier. Now, over to you to get the discussion on the way. I hope our keynote speaker is online at the moment. He's still not online. The time zone difference might be because of the summertime. I will try to get in touch with him, because we normally have 2 hours difference, because the summertime now is 3. So
we still have 6 minutes.
All right, I'll see if I can get hold of Xin Dai and bring him online as soon as we can. Over to you, Rogier. Thanks.
I believe the traditional greeting is good day. Indeed, first and foremost, I'd be remiss, and obviously now she walks off, but in thanking Haemin and her team for the tremendous hard work that has obviously been put into organizing this gathering to such a high degree of organizational quality. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I live in the Netherlands normally, and as many of you, I have been stuck in a fairly small house for the last 3.5 years. And then to be able to spread my wings and come to the other side of the world, particularly in January, is a very pleasant matter indeed. And what makes it even more pleasant is that it brings together many of my old friends with whom I've been collaborating for years, and I'm sure quite a number of new friends whom I shall have met by the end of these 3 days that we will have together. And what makes making those friends and enjoying time with those old friends a lot easier is the fact that we're going to have a whole bunch of interesting things to talk about. Because automated decision-making in China The questions that we will ask and try to grapple at answering on automated decision-making in China stem from the intersection of a number of really interesting trends. Obviously, the key enabling one is technology. China has undoubtedly emerged as the second largest digital player in the world and has been very ambitious in wiring up, or indeed wirelessly wiring up the entire country. The ambition, for instance, that China has shown in bringing broadband connectivity also to poorer regions, to rural regions, and so on and so forth, is quite astonishing. It also reflects particular elements of Chinese statecrafts and official party ideology. Those of you who have been working on Chinese history may remember Mr. Science and Democracy. And those of you who've had the misfortune of ever having to read a Chinese Communist Party senior official speech or an official political report given at events such as the Party Congress will know that they tend to be a litany of long statistics and numbers. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the Communist Party fundamentally believes that governing is a task of science. I was very happy to see in the program that we will have a contribution also on the life and times and work of Tian Xueshen, a scientist and individual who did much to develop methods to take this idea of Mr. Science and Democracy, to take this notion that governing is a matter of applying a scientific program, Marxism, in order to achieve a greater future. Jeremy Wallace's recent work, Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts, reflects on how long before the mass installation of digital technologies, Chinese leaders were already obsessed with quantification, with numbers, with statistics. Borge Bakken, over 20 years ago, wrote a book connecting this to ideas about scientism and scientific governance, where, in essence, the Communist Party sees human society as a very complicated machine, but one, nevertheless, that is not just capable of understanding as it functions along lines similar to natural laws, like the laws of gravity. But if that system can be understood, then it can be predicted and it can be controlled. And it seems to me that we are now at the point where the Communist Party leadership, for better or worse, believes that digital technology, with its data collecting capability and with its computational power, is now delivering the tools to realize that scientific idea. Obviously, many questions present themselves in automated decision-making. Complexity, for one. Can humanity be automated? Are we that predictable? Are we that nudgeable? Are we that steerable? That will be one of the core guiding questions for us over the next 3 days. And I think it's time that we started trying to answer it. And to do so, I really, really hope that we have made contact with Daixin in Beijing. Daixin is also an old friend of ours, and one of the first to write cogently about social credit. And I use the word cogently advisedly because many people in the room will know that cogent writing on social credit system has not always been as present as it should. Unfortunately, the organization for this conference was made before the rather surprising announcement that China would reopen for travel, and so Daixin cannot be physically with us today. But we hope that very soon we will have an opportunity again to raise a cup of tea together and talk about these issues in greater detail. But first, we will still have to make do with Zoom. just to go over the administration and the paperwork, Xin is an associate professor at Peking University Law School, where he works on legal theory, socio-legal studies, economic analysis of law, privacy, and online law. And to then join into discussion with Xin, we have a cornucopia of very interesting voices and contributors who I would like to ask to come and join us here at the front the moment that I call out their name. As you may see in the program, Haemin G is listed, but due to the iniquities of intercontinental travel, she is still somewhere 30,000 feet up. She will join us later today, but I'm afraid, her telephone is on flight mode. Rachel Douglas-Jones is an associate professor at the RMIT University of Copenhagen, working on bureaucracy, policy, and ethics. She's leading a project called the Moving Data, Moving People project, which looks at the social credit system from an ethnographic perspective. Rachel, it's wonderful being here. Rachel was also one of the key voices in our previous conversation in Copenhagen that Jesper and Hai-Ching were just mentioning. Jiang Min is a long-established scholar. Is she here? Oh, she's online. She will join us online. She's a long-established scholar of Chinese media studies, and when I was a little baby academic working on my PhD, one of the people that I would cite the most at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and she has written all across the range of the Chinese digital world, looking at business, media, politics, and she's increasingly branching out on the internationalization of the Chinese online realm. And lastly, and most definitely in the room, is Jack Qiu, another one of these stalwarts of digital studies in China, currently at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Jack is extremely well known, not just for his leadership in the Chinese Internet Research Conference process, but also for his groundbreaking work in connecting digital questions to questions of labor rights and labor justice. So we're going to proceed as follows. We are one panelist short, so those of you who know me a little bit know that I'm impossible to shut up, so I might, jump in with a few comments of my own, completely abusing my chair's privilege. But what we're going to do is we're going to ask Xin to offer his remarks, taking about 30 or 40 minutes. Then we will have initial responses from the panel. But as you can already see from the setup of this room, we would very much like this to be an open conversation rather than a narrow bandwidth, one-to-many communication. So we are then going to ask you to join into the conversation with great enthusiasm.
The next half hour or so, or I guess 40 minutes basically. So I'll talk about some of the observed and perceived failures or problems of automated decision-making applications in very broad sense, which I think is the theme of this conference. About the topic though, when I say localizing ADM's failures in China, by locating I mean to pinpoint to different places that complaint failure arises, and by localizing I mean to suggest that we should consider ADM failures as embedded in cultural contexts and structures, which is China here, right? So rather than just to think about them only in relatively abstract and universal terms, even though those are deep, great thinking. So hopefully this is what people here are interested in. Okay, so I think now for quite a long time, we constantly hear about complaints about how automated decision-making mechanisms or applications are causing troubles in all kinds of contexts. So my background, I'm a legal scholar, so the law is naturally about crafting solutions or thinking about solutions to problems that everybody complains about, day to day, right? So, but when we talk about automated decision making, or I think more loosely the use of computer algorithms in public, societal, commercial decision-making settings, I think the discourse a lot of times are kind of overgeneralized, right? So although the issue actually are really multiplex, even just thinking about them in our minds. So there are a lot of problems, various problems that can be attributed to the use of ADMs. Actually are very different, and they require different approaches to understanding them and possibly solving them, if at all, right? So I think people have nowadays indeed started to work towards distinguishing the issues, right? So what I'm doing here is to work along the same direction as kind of a lawyerly direction. Just try to use, but try to use some alternative conceptual heuristics frameworks to hopefully offer somewhat a useful angle, which we may use to zero in better to the context and patterns in which different ADMs fail differently, and therefore we may somehow see if we can address them differently, right? So now here, I think I've note first that I still use ADM failures in the relatively popular and pragmatic sense, which refers to the disparity between intended and actual effects, right? So by doing this, I try to explore here, or I think we need to think about, is not just how ADM tools may not function as expected for any given task, but also what may be the underlying expectations that people have, consciously or subconsciously, when they talk about, when they evaluate, when they assessment the performance of ADMs they confront with, what are the baseline or reference point they use, right? So I think these are particularly important, not only for law and policy, but particularly for law and policy minded people who, although may think sometimes, as I said, at structural and deep level, but also, we have to separate the issues and then operate in mostly, I would say, localized, but also marginal issue by issue fashions. So a little bit more background here, though. I should also note that as a matter of law and policy, to differentiate ADM or algorithm problems and to tackle them in different ways has also been what's aspired for by the regulatory authorities, including China, but not limited to China, right? So in fact, the overarching principle of the Chinese regulatory authority nowadays announced it will use for regulating the digital economy is in fact called differentiated regulation and management with grading and classification systems. So this is called 分类管理, right? So I think some of you may have learned that. So for the past couple of years, China has delved quite deep into setting up formal regulatory administrative apparatus on algorithms, right? For example, in 2021, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is the key internet regulator, you all know, issued a highly anticipated piece of regulation on recommendation algorithms. So that regulation, in fact, covered pretty much all kinds of ADMs that in the commercial and societal setting people use nowadays. So in the regulation, the regulator calls for multiple authorities to collaborate in setting up a classification system based on the functionality, the impact, the stake of these algorithms. So they cover a lot of possible dimensions that we would use in classifying the algorithms. It also will be, I think it will be quite some time for all these classification systems to be set up. But at this time, at least in this regulation itself, there are two types of categorization that have already been formally set up and put into some use. So one is the technical functionality-based categorization, right? So for example, the regulation includes a formal classification of consumer algorithms into 5 types, right? So the so-called synthetic and generative, personalized content push, ranking selection, search and filtering, task assignment and decision making, so forth, right? So this is a classification fully based on functionality, and this is actually offered by some engineering experts. The regulator consulted at that point when they're drafting this regulation, and then. This is useful, of course, in the sense that if you separate the functionality, different things do different tasks, and then these things actually fall under the jurisdictions of different authorities, right? For example, if this is content-related algorithm, maybe they're regulated by content regulator, whereas it's really just about traffic, about cab ordering. Then they may also need to be regulated by the traffic regulator, etc. So this is one already in the regulation. The other categorization is a binary line drawing, right? So they try to distinguish algorithm as two types. One is those algorithms with public opinion influencing or social mobilization capabilities, right? So these algorithms under the regulation are made subject to a filing and security assessment system, right? So you see the picture, on the slide, which is a screenshot of the filing website, where if you're interested, you may go and find a lot of public filing information. Very interesting, actually, by lots of major internet companies. So I think other than these, I think the regulators are still struggling with their exercise of sorting the beans in different ways, right? So, I think, of course, in the common or popular discourse, there are also, I call symptomatic typologies more commonly used, right? So people talk about different ADM problems in the way that, okay, this is about social discrimination, that is about price discrimination and unfair employment treatment, induced addiction, etc. So these categorization are also mostly descriptive, right? And I think it doesn't do a lot, right, in terms of how these flaws might be different in terms of the responses they might need to be getting. So I'm not saying all these other existing lenses to capture the different ADM problems aren't useful. They are useful, hugely useful. What I try to do here is really just to propose an alternative lens, which I think might shed another kind of light on how these ADMs fail in different ways. So I hope my approach is a little bit more pathological, which might steer people to think and debate about how and why each ADM as applied failed to deliver the expected result, and what are the expectations. So this is really asking ourselves what we actually want from using these things. Okay, so this is the heuristic framework, which I didn't invent, but really just borrow, conveniently from a rather simple 2x2 matrix, that appears, or it's actually a topology that developed in relatively recent work by the social psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, cognitive psychology, I should say. So, and also his co-author, Sansin Sponi. So there's this popular book called Noise, highly recommended. But in that book, and also related work on decision science, Kahneman, and others, they conceptualize what we may use to measure the effectiveness of decisions, right, made by either human or machines, along two dimensions, namely how biased they are and how noisy they are, right? So to put it simply, the level of bias measures how decisions made are systematically off the target that it purports to optimize, and the level of noise of decision, meanwhile, measures about how widely scattered decisional tools outcomes are distributed. So if it is too widely distributed, then the decision tool or mechanism should be understood as not useful, as it won't produce usefully predictable, reliable decisions. So a very simple illustration. If we look at the graph on the right-hand side, these four teams, right, in an archery competition really illustrate this, right? So they represent the four types of decision-making tools that Kahneman co-authors measure along the dimensions of bias and noise, right? So the upper left team, A, represents effective decision-making, right? So they are reliably hitting the bullseye, not much bias or noise. Upper right, team B represent bias but not noise decision-making. So it's systematically biased away from the bullseye, but the shots are not scattered. The lower left, C, represent noisy but not biased decision-making, right? So the shots are the shots are not biased systematically towards one direction or the other, but they're just too scattered, so that even the shorter eyes thing probably wouldn't have an idea where next arrow will fall. And then the lower right, team D represents decision making that is both biased and noisy. So you see the arrows are systematically biased towards the lower left direction, and also is quite scattered. So I think this graph illustrates Haemin's idea quite clearly. And also, I mentioned that Haemin's book is not really about ADM alone, but also it's really just about decision making in general. I think one argument they make, though, in the book is, I think somewhat highly relevant here, is that human decision making is actually well known to be noisy and biased, or both, right? So in many high stake contexts, that's the case, ranging from court adjudication to public policy. So what they argue there is, in light of more popular discourse against machine decisions, so that's the popular discourse, they are trying to be a little bit contrarian, which is they want to say ADM or algorithms may be helpful too if we really understand where they could be helpful, which is a lot of times, first, we will want to reduce noise and sometimes even bias with ADM, and those things are actually inherent in human mind. So I think this argument is overall persuasive to me. There are disagreements, but I think most importantly, the inspiration here is, I think it's worth taking one step further from his general comparison between machine and human decision making. So we might also use the framework to zero in onto the ADM itself, right? So I generate a similar topology, still using Haemin's two dimensions to see if there's something interesting that can be produced from this exercise. So we'll see. Okay, so here, this is the topology of ADM failures. I'm still working on it, so definitely see if this might be interesting. But so I focus on illustrating the different types of failures with Chinese examples here, right? But no doubt, I think people here at the conference are all familiar with examples from the Western societies, right? So we're all comparatives, right? So but still, all are Chinese examples. I'll discuss each of the four quadrants one by one in the following slide. But here, I think just to give a general flavor, I think on the upper left here, so the high bias, high noise ADM failures would describe the situations where the ADM mechanism is known to produce partial and unreliable, unstable outcomes, which causes both inequity and chaos, right? So I think in recent memories, the health code, Jiang application used to restrict mobility for pandemic control purposes. And also, it's in particular, it's collapsed in the last several months leading up to the government's pandemic policy shift in the end of 2022. I think it's a notable example. I explain why. Another example is the content moderation or censorship system instituted as social media platforms. I'll also explain later. On the lower left, the high bias, low noise ADMs are those, I think, that generate systematically biased outcomes in favor of some groups at the expense of others, right? So such bias is itself not intended, or at least not officially intended, or deemed desirable, acceptable, right? So this type of ADM failures correspond to the algorithmic discrimination problems that in the Western discourse, I think, are often the predominant concern people have in contexts such as criminal justice, credit reporting, school admissions, so on and so forth. So in China, actually, I would say you don't have the classical scenario where, for example, a credit reporting agency will run report in particularly specifically against certain, for example, ethnic group. That doesn't happen. The closest thing we get here is that the commercial or sometimes even public credit reporting system are sometimes they will be critiqued for biased against small size enterprises or small medium sized enterprises, SMEs, right? So also I should know that there has also been a lot of talk recently in recent years in popular discourse, but I don't think that's in professional discourse. In popular discourse, worrying about how, for example, some automated resume filtering system or employment background check systems commonly used in corporations may produce biased decisions against, for example, female job seekers, people graduating from less prestigious college, or people from certain hometown provinces. So the worry is plausible because all these kind of discriminations exist in offline settings, but I just haven't really located one particular case which really illustrating so these decisions are produced by automated process as opposed to there are actually some human in the process. So that's the second quadrant. On the upper right, the low bias, high noise ADMs are those that fail because they produce outcomes that are often unpredictable and erroneous, although not necessarily showing any clear bias for or against particular individuals or groups. So I think lots of the rudimentary or early stage e-government systems that have been reported to be dysfunctional would fall in this category. For example, in China, there are cases where certain government pension systems are reported to erroneously terminate pension receivers' payment because the system mistook the individual to be dead, but they're not, right? So and that might be for system and data errors. Also, there are more intuitive examples, right? So, which is the recommendation algorithm used at the platforms, which are actually often complained by consumers as obnoxious for that. They use personalized recommendation, of course, but personalized recommendation are supposedly really push to you only the stuff that you want, right? But in fact, they often mistook your preference and push to you a lot of things that you don't want to see. So I may say that even the system for driverless car can be thought of as low bias, high noise, but I'll leave that out from this presentation as for this interest of time. So on the lower right, the low bias, low noise ADMs, those may be a little bit more tricky when we think about them or when we call them failure, because it appears that to be functioning well, right? So they're making decisions reliably hitting the intended target. But here the problem, I think, is that it's also important that we bring in the baseline or reference point question, which is the societal expectation of what the ADM should do, right? As opposed to merely how a particular entity using these ADMs hope that it will perform. So these ADMs got protested against mostly because the goal the system tries to optimize collided with other social values, right? So examples may be found in outcries against the gig work platforms, algorithmic work assignment systems, as well as debates over the so-called algorithmic price discrimination practiced by e-commerce platforms, right? Okay, so this is the basic topology. I'm sure you guys may be now thinking to yourselves, about whether any of these particular examples does fit into their respective quadrant. I'm definitely happy to hear or learn how you think, because I'm still myself working on them. And also I'm sure some of them may be questionable. But while you do that, I think let me proceed to show you further about the way that I think to think about things in this way might be useful in terms of looking at the ADM failures and trying to proceed. Okay, so we start with the first combination, high bias, high noise, right? So we find that ADM fails because it produces high bias, high noise decisions. Simple response may be that we just toss them away, right? But I guess the situation may often be a little bit more complicated than that, right? So because in the abstract sense, of course, no one would have wanted to adopt any ADM that gets us to a place where that's worse than right now without them, right? But in reality, I think when we speak about high bias, high noise, we're not necessarily using the word, using the world with only human decision making as a reference point, but also a lot of time using our rather vague but rosy, expectation or idea about a functional or well-functioning ADM as the reference point, right? So this is possible that lots of the high bias, high noise ADMs are still doing the job some way or in ways that humans cannot in terms of speed, scale, accuracy, but really it's just the bias and noise are just too obvious and to ignore and so widely viewed as intolerable, unacceptable, right? So this is the hard part, right? So I think in this case, I would be cautious to say, okay, so we just solve this problem by just tossing them away. And then what to do? I think at one level, we may simply consider that these high bias, high noise ADMs as defective products and regulate them as such, right? So that means if we would still consider or allow their presence and use, we should also hope that under the pressure of competition on one hand and somewhat adapted product liability regime on the other hand, we will eventually see technologists and regulators work together to refine them, to reduce the level of noise and bias. So I think generally speaking, the content moderation or filtering algorithm used by the mainstream social media platforms, although of course we could really like them or hate them very much, and of course they are still very problematic, but the trajectory seems to be evolving toward that direction. Even though, of course, I wouldn't delve into this. Content moderation is really an intricate, complex issue, but still, I think there seems to be hope that people are working on reducing the bias and noise there to a certain extent. But I think importantly, here the critical presumption in any area is that we would presume that there are competitive regulatory pressure, but these things can never be taken as given, right? We all know, for example, for digital economy, market structure is a huge issue, and competition also may not be dependable when it comes to public sector ADMs, right? So and those are also often to be found as high bias, high noise. So beyond that, beyond the very conventional approach, then what? I think one popular, but I would say, I have to say, somehow naive idea is to ensure human intervention will be readily available all the time, or even mandatory, so that to the extent that we will continue using the ADMs, we make sure that humans are on the side and will intervene to address the bias and noise. So that's totally reasonable, but also I think it's harder to do than just to think broadly. So I think one parallel, particularly illustrated in the health code debacle of 2022 here in China, might actually illustrate this point, right? So I think during that time, which is about 3 to 4 months, prior to the open up. So there are hundreds of thousands of people actually complaining about being restricted from domestic travels within China, which is often just a trip back home, right? Because their code in the smartphone app turns red, meaning that they were deemed as having been to locations of high COVID exposure risks. Right. So the complaint about this code on surface is really that the ADM mechanism inherent in the code is biased and noisy. It biased against people with certain travel log, even though not all of them are actually of exposure risk, right? So or not of higher exposure risk than those people who don't have those travel logs. And also it is complaint is noisy in the sense that there are indeed a lot of errors about where people have been, whether they do have exposure risk. But I think eventually, as people know how this works better, people realize that how one gets his or her code is actually far from fully automated, right? So they thought it's automated, so they complain about the machine, about the algorithm, but actually it's far from fully automated. The process have a lot of room for human participation, right? So first, you do have a vast army of street level bureaucrats who are given the power to review and prove people's petitions for changing their code from red to green, and that happens, right? So which make this system half automated at most, or even less, right? So and also, as a result, you do have local officials here and there would abuse their power to use the code to restrict mobility for non-COVID, control purposes, right? So then what's the lesson here? At least to me, I think it's really a cautionary tale about how human intervention might be the cause rather than the cure for ADM failures. But does that mean that we should then pursue a higher level automation? I think that might not be, right? So that really depends, because without necessarily solving the problems of ADM, so it's really just pushing the problem to the other quadrants, which we'll see whether problems there are less difficult or more. Okay, so the second type of failure, high bias, low noise. So this is what I referred to a situation where people are mostly concerned with about the systematically discrimination problem produced by ADMs. So I should know that here that it doesn't mean here these kind of ADMs that definitely have no noise. That's impossible. All of them have, but it's really just not the foremost concern here. Which is the bias, right? So I think people working on ADMs are most familiar with these issues, and I wouldn't repeat all the great work that has been done, but the key here is we all know algorithmic discrimination often results and really just augment the effect of underlying societal discrimination, right? So in that sense, it should be easy to see that discrimination, I think, would work in ADM, also offline, right? Work not all the same, quite differently in China as it does in the West, right? So I'm not expanding very much here, but I think generally speaking, the focal point of discrimination here in China is much less concentrated as in the West on race and ethnicity, right? So there are tons of thousands of types of discrimination in China along all possible or thinkable dimensions. But also in that way, it's also a lot of times it's also more volatile and mobile than entrenched, right? And also, you know, in certain contexts, discriminations along different dimensions may also sort of cancel each other out. But still, I think to the extent that ADM produce unacceptable discriminatory effect, such as in, for example, the commercial public credit evaluation situation where the system automatically will reject application by small entrepreneurs for certain bank credit or, you know, public project participation rights, what to do, right? Or in case, eventually, I think we will get there, that we will have all these automated resume filtering algorithms that would automatically and discriminatorily, of course, filter out, for example, female applicants. We don't have this kind of case yet. I'll still have to say we have similar case already litigated in the court, but it's you know, it's about using a system, but then, you know, to using a system to collect these applications, but the review is actually done by humans. So we have cases there, but we don't have the fully automated kind of a employment discrimination situation here. But they might come, right? So what to do if we do have this? Well, I would say that there really isn't much news here, though, but for the usually proposed legal or regulatory safeguard that, you know, we should put in place to deal with these kind of you know, thing all the time, right? So we might have to regulate or even prohibit the most undesirable data processing practices that may be deemed as of a high discrimination risk, right? So of course, you know, the law, the administration, the bureaucracy use them. They're far from being perfectly effective solution. But again, I think here, one thing is, I would say that discriminatory effect might actually be easier to become detectable if such effect is generated by the ADMs instead of the humans, so that the, you know, the intervention might actually not be so implausible as people consider. So besides, I will also add even here that although we may say that high bias ADM may result from underlying discrimination, sometimes there could be the societal policy or market incentives to address such bias. For example, still in the credit reporting situation. So when you have the general monetary policy shifted from you know, curtail credit to expanding credit, then the credit evaluation algorithm to rules may be changed to significantly lower, reduce its bias against small enterprises, individual borrowers, etc. Okay, so now moving to the third type of failure, low bias, high noise. This is, of course, includes those situations where the ADM causes bizarre and incomprehensible errors, right? So many of the rudimentary, you know, e-government or early stage e-government application may fall in this category. The complaints that people typically have is that there are just too many errors, so they're adding to people's hassle. So in the picture, right, so you see it's quite common that government front desks, right, so once they equip with these kind of systems, they will also have to assign another human staff to help people use them, right? And most importantly, these staff are there because it is anticipated these systems quite often fail, so that visitors will have to be again directed to a human bureaucrat to deal with or process their issues. So of course, you should, you know, on each specific incident, this might just be considered as tolerable hassle. Although, you know, if aggregated, so the magnitude of inefficiency could be pretty significant. So that will have interest in improving it. So the government overall, indeed, you know, many of you must know, you know, has consistently tried to up their game in this area. So places like Shanghai, Zhejiang, relatively advanced places, the applications in recent 5 to 10 years have been increasingly become sophisticated and successful, right? So, but again, as previously said, you know, this is public sector adoptions, right? So I guess we can never be sure that everybody will have the universal kind of incentive to make it better, make it work, right? So when these things cause errors, though, so the way to deal with them, I think, also is not super kind of a novel problem. You just have to put in the procedural safeguard that we see everywhere, so that people have chance to prevent, petition to correct mistakes made by the machines, as they are made by humans. So there are lots of so there are actually lots of technical discussions about how to do this in the Chinese or overseas administrative law literature, which are, I think, very important, hugely useful, but I just don't think they're super novel or interesting or unexpected. So then what about the low bias, high noise ADMs in the market setting, though? So that's kind of interesting. So I mentioned personalized recommendation. People, of course, on one way, people complain about these algorithms for being biased, but also it's interesting to see that another type of complaint is that these algorithms are often noisy, in the sense that, okay, so of course, there's definitely going to be a high likelihood that people search for milk formula, for example, baby formula, will also be looking for diapers. But it's also certain there are many of them who are going to not to be looking for diapers and might actually be amused or even offended when they see what the algorithm pushed to them. Similarly, right, so for example, in social media, so where one search for perhaps a racy piece of news might get you so many inappropriate post messages that you will become furious, right? So for these situations, I think there may be also market pressure for firms to care about consumer experience a loss due to the high noise, right? But again, I think the condition here we said is, you got to have market competition there. But also we see that the CEC regulation, the regulation I mentioned before about recommendation algorithms, they do also try to deal with these problems, right? Try to give them some regulatory pressure. But one tricky thing with the regulatory pressure is that sometimes they might help reduce noise, but a lot of times they actually are only just adding the bias into this, right? For example, the CEC regulation, it tries to, of course, reduce the chance people see unwanted, inappropriate messages, but it also requires that official propaganda be given priority in recommendation display, right? So that creates high bias. So that will also shift the problem to the high bias quadrants. Okay, finally, find the low bias, low noise ADMs. So these are deemed failed only because, as I said, the society at large, or at least a significant portion of them, of the public, find the decisions made by these ADMs objectionable, right? But then the people, the entity, the firm that use them, probably are happy with what they're doing. They don't think they're with intolerable noise or bias. So a good example of this may be, gig work platform, which, for example, the food delivery platform, the work assignment monitoring system they use to match available workers with consumer task request orders, and also dictate the routes for delivery to optimize efficiency and consumer satisfaction. Generally, so the consumers like the result, right? I like the result. I'm probably going to use them for lunch today. So because they optimize for you, right? But the workers actually hate them, protest against them, thinking the system squeeze them too much, and neglect the workers' need for safety, leisure time, or even dignity, right? So that's one example. The other example is, price algorithms, e-commerce platform use, right, which in recent years have been accused to practice price discrimination against certain types of consumers. So we use the word discrimination here as in price discrimination, but I also categorize it as low bias because it's actually not deviating from what the developer, the user, the entity tries to do, right? So the platform clearly just intends to use these kind of algorithm system to extract more surplus by pricing the same good higher to consumers who have a higher willingness to pay, right, so to speak. So, but of course, we see consumers hate them, right? So in such scenarios, the goal, I think, would be a little bit different, right? So so previously in the other quadrants, we hope to see if there are ways to reduce the level of bias, noise, or both. Here, the tough question is how are we going to settle the clash or conflict between different values or claims? So for gig work, platform between consumers and workers, I think the official stance in 2021 is to unequivocally stand on the side of the workers, although in reality, and especially in current economic situation, I think the pro-labor policy stance probably will step back a little. On price discrimination is also a more complex question economically, but there is also similar kind of fluctuation back and forth. So therefore, I would say these types of ADMs may be posing the real tough questions. They're tough because that's right? Because the ADM questions are only hard where we humans don't necessarily know or have the clue about what's actually the right thing to do. So I think the society eventually will, or actually already have called for some kind of accountability regimes to be imposed on these kind of ADMs, so as to ensure that although the public preference and interest will be volatile and shifting, what these systems do, they may be checked from time to time to ensure that they are aligned with the public preference. But here, I guess one danger is that in the course of requiring accountability, human intervention might be participate, and also might actually easily go excessive, and cause these ADMs to degenerate into the high bias, high noise category that we go back all the way to the start. So, okay, I'm concluding. This is basically the survey I want to give all of you. I'm not sure if it's useful, but hopefully at least it's somewhat interesting. And also, I'm not able to, at this point, to draw any profound conclusions at all. But indeed, I think just after going through this exercise, at least there are these things that stick out to me. So first, I think most obviously, we see in many cases, we probably would just treat ADM failures as other consumer product, defect, and depend on competition and regulation to see them evolve and becoming refined. And of course, the market incentives are always, not dependable, so that a lot of times we still have to fall back on the conventional, existing procedural or accountability tools. So in that way, I would say we may first just find out some of the problems are not super novel at their core, especially from the law and policy perspective. So that's the first thing. Second, I think there's also a good cautionary tale from reviewing the panoply of the Chinese practices, right? So we do see here and there the peril of having too much human in the loop, right? So sometimes ADMs fail not necessarily because lack of human oversight, but also could be because of excessive human interference, right? So I actually thought this should be an obvious point, but nowadays, as I get more into this area, I thought that maybe we always worry about out of control automation, but sometimes we forgot to worry about ourselves. Third and finally, so I think during the course of surveying the 4 types of ADM failures, I know that failure, or you may call it defect problem, is largely a subjective cultural construct premise on how people in a given social community expect ADMs to function, right? So then what's the Chinese society cultural expectation for ADM, and how does that affect assessment of the performance of all kinds of ADMs already in existence in China? I think that's the critical question. I hope all of you will agree. So I think generally speaking, and also based on some of the studies that have already been done, even by some of you, right? So I think the Chinese population, I do think Chinese population have consistent show somewhat a pragmatic preference toward ADMs, right? So they care about whether these things indeed are effective, indeed useful, whether they does perform better along the bias and noise dimension. And they are relatively troubled less by the abstract concept of surveillance and discrimination per se. And given this, my observation is that people tend to show greater patience if they are somewhat convinced that certain ADM failures are kind of temporary, transitory, and may improve along the time. And when it comes to public sector ADMs, it's also interesting that there is a widely shared perception that ADMs may be more neutral and reliable and efficient than the street level bureaucrats, in whom the Chinese people actually have long had relatively lower trust because they deal with them day to day. They saw they have corruption problem, laziness, all of that, right? So this might somehow contrast with the view popular among the Western theorists that believe ADM somehow might undermine the legitimacy of democratic and administrative state. So I think these cultural attitudes, I would speculate on one hand, might have made greater room for ADM applications even many of obviously low quality to proliferate in China. And also on the other hand, this attitudes might be inducing stronger public outcry against certain ADM once these ADM become exposed to be actually not so automated, but actually involve significant human meddling or interference, just as the health code backcode suggests, right? So I think in social psychology, there's a name for these phenomena. It's called betrayal aversion, right? Which refers to the phenomena where people might have stronger negative emotional reaction to the bad outcomes. If these bad outcomes occur, the process involves betrayal of trust. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much again for listening and being patient, and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks.